Julia, Davey, and company have been working on this for a while, and from the moment I found out about it, I was like, "Tell me everything." And it required just a ton of data and analysis for us to actually be able to look at this story. But what it revealed is that there's a troubling element to how law enforcement has turned increasingly to Google over the past couple of years, and the location history that people have on their phone, search data, all of that has basically become a tool that can reverse engineer people who are at scenes of crimes, and sometimes being at a location, near a location, does not actually mean that you did the crime. And that's sort of where it gets interesting, and where privacy experts in particular are a little terrified of how this is actually shaping up in the real world. So Julie, let's start with you. How did you happen upon this story, and where did you have to go in order to piece it all together?
Sure. Well, in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, there was a lot of interest in how law enforcement would use all of the data that Google has about us. And so we wanted to look at the search warrants that police are submitting to Google, because we knew that that was the best way that we could get a handle on what was actually happening. And so to do that, Davey and I and our colleagues fanned out to different courthouses around the country, and we just took it page by page, thumbing through these warrants, identifying the ones that were submitted to Google, and then scrutinizing them to see the nature of the case and what cops ultimately got.
So give us an example of how this has played out in the real world.
So one interesting example, there was a young detective in North Carolina. He's getting ready for work. He leaves his car running, and he comes out, and the car's gone, and inside is some police gear.
The police car is gone. Like,
yes, it's his personal vehicle. Yeah, but there's gear inside, and it's gone. And the department tells him, they're very supportive. They reassure him it'll be all right. But then they go to work, and they turn to Google. They send them a warrant for everyone whose devices were near the place where the vehicle disappeared. And they also asked for information about people who searched for the model of the radio. And Google told us that they didn't provide search data, but they did provide some location data. And so this is, just a real world example of how property crimes are attracting these requests.
And obviously with that information, they were able to get the radio back, right?
They were not.
Okay.
The radio
Just making
is
sure.
outstanding.
Just checking to see.
So, Davey, come on in on this, because what it really turns upside down, and you guys lay this out so clearly in the story, the idea of a search warrant, right, would be typically on an individual, right? And now you've got, thanks to Google, you can take a location and kind of search for information, but it feels like it opens up, that information can reach a wider swath potentially of individuals, some who may not at all be connected to a possible crime. So come on in on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So tech companies hold a lot of data on people. That's no surprise. But usually when you think of search warrants in the traditional sense, you would think, okay, police are looking at this one suspect. Let's go and learn more about them, and maybe we'll serve a search warrant to a company to get information on a particular individual, a suspect. In this case, police are using the most basic parameters to even jumpstart sort of leads when they don't have any leads. So they'll, for instance, give 4 location coordinates. These are just XY coordinates on a map. And then within these 4 points, you'll draw like a little polygon, and then they will say to a judge, like, we have reasonable expectations that there will be a criminal that we can find within this area if you sign off on this warrant for a certain period of time. So that's geofence warrants. And then, police are also increasingly using search warrants keyword search warrants, I should say, which are, sort of warrants that are served to Google to try to surface people who have Googled a certain term. So in one of the cases that we covered in our story, there was a terrible crime. It was an arson, and a family died in this fire. And what investigators did was go to Google and say, hey, did anyone search for this address? So that yielded some suspects in that case.
Well, let's stick with that one, because that one hasn't totally played out yet, and it gets to, I think, maybe the ultimate tension in the story, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That one, the Colorado Supreme Court is going to rule on it. We don't know exactly when, but we're expecting it to come down at some point this year, to just sort of decide whether or not Google providing that data to investigators was an overreach on the investigators' part. And if you think about especially searching on Google, that is just so many people that could ensnare. Going back to the example that Julia mentioned at the very beginning, police had served Google with a warrant for anyone searching on this particular car radio model, and Google did not turn over data in that case, to be clear. But you could imagine people like radio enthusiasts who might be searching for a particular radio model completely innocently, who could potentially get swept up in one of these warrants. So
I'm guessing privacy experts have something to say about this, and activists, because, if Carol, Tim, and I get swept up in the same search, I didn't do it. Okay, I didn't do it. But
I did.
Tim did.
Somebody borrowed my phone.
And I'm making fun of something that is incredibly serious. But what do the privacy advocates have to say about all of this?
Julia, you want to come back? Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So privacy advocates are very concerned about both of these techniques. The thing is, if there's no suspect involved, then the only way that Google can provide a list of hits is to search everyone's data. And so law enforcement will receive, a short list of people who fit the criteria, and they then have to go through and identify who they think, might be their suspect. But everyday people who had nothing to do with the crime are often swept up by these warrants. And so I think that's really the heart of privacy advocates' concerns. And legislation has been proposed in California and New York that would ban the police from seeking these warrants of Google. The legislation has stalled so far, but activists are still hoping to get something done on that front. And the Colorado case would also be the first time that a court weighs in on the constitutionality of that keyword search technique.
Okay, so how does Google feel all about this?
It puts them in a difficult spot. These are court orders. They're not optional. Google has to comply, and they often are important cases. However, safeguarding user privacy is, a key responsibility that they have, and so they have to walk a very fine line there.
Okay, so what about inside? There's the official Google response, and then there's what you were able to report from within the company with some great reporting. What did some of those sources reveal?
Yeah, so we found that there's a department within Google that's responsible for scrutinizing these requests. It's a mix of lawyers and LIS specialists, and those specialists, the rank and file, they're often just a few years out of college. Some of them harbor dreams of becoming a lawyer, and I think they're often quite motivated by, this job of really scrutinizing law enforcement requests. We heard of examples in which they were really just looking for any reason to send the request back to law enforcement. In one case, an officer might send a request for email from an account ending in @gmail.com, but if the officer has a typo, if they say @gamble.com, that's a no. They would send that request back. But nonetheless, if it's been signed off by a judge, eventually they're going to get something.
And by the way, LIS, Legal Investigation Support. I find this just fascinating because it's like Google's kind of, their hands are tied here, right? Like,
yeah.
If law enforcement asks for something, a judge signs off on it, they're gonna have to comply. But I love that there's like this element within the company that's like, you spelled Gmail wrong, you're not gonna get what you're asking for.
I once spelled Gmail wrong when I'm trying to pay a traffic ticket, parking ticket, so I had to pay it twice.
Oh,
yeah, because I got a late fee for it. So I always check how I spell Gmail.
But the point is, once they give information on a case, how can they pick and choose, right? Like once the door is open, like you do wonder if they're asked and requested, as long as they get the Gmail right. Yeah. Do they just have to do it, Julia?
Yes, I think there's an old adage in Silicon Valley: if you build it, they will come. They say essentially, if you collect this data, law enforcement will come knocking, and they will eventually find a way to get it. And so I think that's just the heart of this issue. Google collects this data in large part because it helps them sell advertising, and as a result, they are in this uncomfortable position.
Hey, Davey, Alba, come back in here. I always wonder when people work on a story like this and learn so much about how our information is collected. Are you going to change the way you use these services personally?
Did you burn your phone?
I mean, I'm just curious. Like after reading the story, I want to change the way I use these services.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's a good reminder to all of us to take a look at our opt-out / opt-in options on our settings for various Google services. Google told us that this one product that they particularly use to store location data called Location History is off by default, but they do send notifications to people to sort of suggest, hey, do you want to turn this feature on? It could help you in all sorts of ways. For instance, if you wanted to remember where you were last week or see how many miles you've traveled, or just kind of have a cool record of where you've been and, what places you've visited.
Right.
And I think that that's not always clear when you're getting these features pitched to you, that there could be privacy consequences there.
I just want to end on a big number. Google says it received a record 60,472 search warrants in the U.S. last year. That's more than double the number from 2019.